Hi, I'm Alison Bateman-House. I am a professor of medical ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and I specialize in issues about access to investigational medicines in clinical trials and outside of clinical trials.
All right, wonderful. So I am here with Allison at Bio International in San Diego, and we came, AiArthritis, myself, as media, which has been interesting in itself. I'll do a little special segment on that experience. But I had the opportunity as being media to hand select people that I thought would be extremely interesting for the show. If you've been following the work we do at AiArthritis, you know that for several years we've been extremely invested in precision medicine, in particular that our diseases, autoimmune, autoinflammatory arthritis diseases, are so unique per individual. And the current treatments that are out there, about 40% of us are responding, and there's such a need because it's a lot of money going into these biologics and these treatments. And we know that at the end, we'll really be able to hopefully save a lot of money for the patient long term, being able to identify, but we need to get into these subgroups. We need more than N of ones. And so even though it's a lot in the cancer space right now, we are in line and there's a lot of research going on. Our organization saw a lot at EULAR. We just got back last week. So now I'm here, and at the American College of Rheumatology as well. So Allison, you had a session, you spoke in a session today. Now, I'm not going to even butcher the name. AGO. Can you? Oh, ASC. I didn't even do that right. I butchered the acronym. That's even worse. So I wanted to know, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about that and what the session was about?
So I'm an ethicist, and I'm many other things, including a public health practitioner, but I am not a clinical researcher nor a doctor. So asking me to describe ASO is challenging. So ASO stands for antisense oligonucleotide. It's a class of drug. That's about all I know about it. Mm-hmm. But it's a relatively new area of research that has gotten people really excited, simply because there was a proof of concept that blew everyone away. There was an ASO developed for a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, which in its most severe form was a universally fatal disease. Children died generally by the age of 2, and there was no treatment. And ASO has transformed this into a survivable condition. Now, the technology is so new, we can't say that it's giving them a full lifespan. We don't know, but they're meeting their developmental milestones. They are not acting like children with SMA. So the research field as a whole has been super excited about the idea that this apparently is like, it's sort of like instruction manual for proteins, and it can either tell a protein stop making this protein or make more of this protein or make it differently. And so, in theory, there's a vast number of applications, anything that involves proteins in the body. And so the question is, for these individualized, is if you have a mutation and if you're able to do the basic science to figure out what's happening. Is it something's happening too frequently, not happening enough, happening, the wires are crossed or something. Can you then design an ASO specifically to stop whatever that inappropriate behavior is and correct it with the appropriate behavior? So there's certainly more than just ASOs for spinal muscular atrophy, but that was sort of the proof of concept that has gotten everyone super excited. And I hear that they are, in drug development terms, fairly cheap to make, which of course means super expensive still because it's drug development, but as compared to like a gene therapy or something. So that's part of the reason why there's so much excitement about them.
Oh, okay. So now, again, your role being the ethics part of it. So can you tell us a little bit about how the ethics plays into this exciting development?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spend a lot of time talking with drug developers and patient advocacy groups that are involved in the drug development process and FDA and you name it. And drug development happens for populations. And we all know that not every patient resembles that population for whom the drug was developed. We know that clinical trials are made up of samples that have been carefully picked, and they're carefully picked for a reason. But sometimes people are excluded from the trials that in the long run are going to want to be using that drug or that intervention. And sometimes we see results in trials that are not duplicated in the real world simply because there's so much difference between the trial sample population and the real world patient population. So I spent a lot of time talking with drug companies, biotechs, pharmaceuticals, anyone who will listen about who's your end user population and what do you need to do upstream to get the data necessary, to know that this product is going to be effective and safe in them, and also to create robust enough information that payers and regulators are going to be willing to put that class of person on the label or say we will pay for it. So the example I always use is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is a chronic life-limiting disease, typically in boys, and they lose ambulation in their teens. It's a terrible disease. Most clinical trials do not involve non-ambulatory boys, simply because the easy thing to calculate or to observe in a trial is when do you lose ambulation. And so if you start with boys who are non-ambulatory, you lose that ability to have that as a very easy measurable endpoint.
Okay.
Well, at this point in time, if you have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, you're going to lose ambulation. So that means the drugs are being tested on people, but those people do not necessarily constitute the entire population. There are already people who have lost ambulation. They may want to try these drugs anyway. We don't know if they're going to be helpful, harmful. We don't know anything because they weren't in the trials. But we know damn well that the payers aren't going to pay for it because they are expensive drugs, and they'll say, I have no evidence that it's going to be helpful.
Oh, this is such a big issue.
So this is what I spend a lot of time talking about. And so with ASOs, it's interesting in two ways. One is with, for example, the spinal muscular atrophy, it was drug development. There was a population. They chose the sickest of the sick, type 1 SMA children. Again, they normally die by 2 years of age. So that's a pretty time-limited trial, right? You have your answer pretty quickly. Did this child who was projected to die within 2 years die or not? But there's type 2, there's type 3, there's type 4, and there were decisions made on the company level about who was going to be in the trial and who wasn't. And this had implications for who was able to use the drug afterwards. So even right now, some of the less affected patients are having problems getting their hands on this drug that at least in the more impacted patients has been truly transformational, simply because there's a lack of data about whether it would help them. So I'm always trying to look at it and say, who's your end user? Like your broad spectrum end user, and what can we do up front to try to make sure that we get the data necessary? A, we don't want to be giving them the drug if it's going to hurt them.
Right.
But B, we want to be able to have robust evidence that will convince regulators, payers, clinicians, and anyone else who needs convincing that this is a good idea for this patient. So that's the population side of ASOs. Right. But then the individual side of ASOs are there things that they are so rare, you're never going to get a population. We talk about N of 1. Yes. Now, I personally think there's no such thing as an N of 1 genetic mutation. I mean, it just means you haven't found the other people.
And that is number of 1.
Number of 1. So, and other terms for them are bespoke. You know, you talk about a bespoke suit that's made just for you. So like a bespoke mutation where it's just you who has that mutation. Yeah, I truly don't believe that there are such things. I just think that they're exceedingly rare.
Right.
But the problem in that case is there is no financial incentive for a company to take on developing a product.
Right.
So in drug development, we talk about rare disease, we talk about ultra rare disease, we even talk about ultra rare disease. We're now talking about something that is like beyond ultra rare. We don't really know what the number is.
Right.
So we have people who talk about N of 1. I don't think N of 1 exists. Some people, I think FDA says maybe like up to N of 5.
Okay.
There's a charitable organization in this area called In Lorem that says N of 30. Really, I think the number is going to keep expanding because it's hard for people to say, here's the absolute dividing line.
Right,
but
right.
The dividing line is it potentially profitable for a company to develop this or not? And so I call it N of too few to be financially profitable.
Okay.
And that's going to vary, right? So if you're in a very poor country or a marginalized population, you could have a higher number of people, but it's still not going to be profitable to develop something. Look at malaria, right? Malaria, like it affects millions of people worldwide, but it hasn't really been seen as profitable to develop a vaccine for it. However, if you have something where it's a relatively well-off patient population, they have power, they have political power, they could probably lobby to get insurers to pay for it. You can have a smaller number and it is going to be commercially viable. So I don't think that there's like this number, but what we're looking at is we're looking at two ends of the spectrum. One is where there is a patient population, it's seen as commercially interesting to a company, and ethically, what do we do about the people who don't fit into that population, but who still are deserving of care. And scientifically, there's no reason why we can't help them. It's just that commercially they got excluded. And then on the other side, these people who, again, scientifically, there's probably ways we could help them, but there's no commercial incentive to do so.
Right.
So they're two polar ends of the patient population, but it's the commercial viability in both cases that impact access.
So some of the things that I'm pulling out specific to our population, we at AiArthritis do a lot of work in regards to this we call atypical. So you've got your typical general patient population who can be in trials. And I mentioned the ethics of step therapy paper that I wrote with the help of a couple bioethicists in 2015, where we zeroed in on that. It was, okay, well, if you're not in the general patient population and you're still being prescribed treatments that worked good for these people, but that's why only 40% of us respond once these expensive drugs get to market, because this other 60% weren't in that general patient population. And, with health technology assessments and value assessments and health economics and trying to make sure, okay, well, this cost justifies us giving you access to this treatment. All of that sort of rolling into each other. We care and we advocate very strongly for precision medicine because we see that as that opportunity to get the data and make everyone count, so to speak. So we do have some rare diseases under our umbrella, not the N of 5s, but that makes for somewhat of a challenge as well. And research is very early in our diseases, whereas there's cancer tests and treatments that are now hitting the market. What would you say to our population of patients who really want to get behind this and support this, knowing that there are these sort of challenges that lie ahead? And ethically speaking, we count and we matter. And is there any type of, takeaway that you could advise them to really focus in on while we're doing the fight to get to these treatments?
Well, sure. So again, I always look at it in terms of who is our ideal end user. And that involves work, right? You have to do the sort of epidemiological work of figuring out what's the prevalence and, what are the subtypes and how many subtypes. And that's where you're talking about, the need for the precision medicine. We need to be able to more accurately understand this. And that people need to understand why that's important and to prioritize it. But what I encourage companies and advocacy groups and others to do is once you have that information available, to say we need to be very clear-eyed in looking at what developmental efforts are happening and who is going to be excluded. So, for example, if I'm going to go back to Duchenne muscular dystrophy again, just because I know it. If we know non-ambulatory boys are excluded from the trials, we know they're going to have a hard time getting access downstream. If we know that there are different mutations involved in that disease, if we know that all the drug companies working on gene therapies are only working on one of the mutation, we know that the boys with the other mutations are going to be left behind. I said earlier that Duchenne muscular dystrophy is typically in boys. We know there's a tiny handful of females, girls, who show these same sort of phenotypic expression. They're totally left behind. They're not in the trials. They're not on the drug label. It's never been tested to see if it impacts their fertility, et cetera.
Oh, wow.
So to me, you have to think and say, in the United States, there's this divide between the product, which the FDA decides when it can be brought to market, and a doctor's prescribing ability. As long as a product has been brought to market, a doctor can prescribe it for anything off-label. And so I want you to look at it from the point of view of a doctor who's trying to help a patient and say, even if there's not good evidence there, what is this doctor likely to prescribe to a patient? And then what do we need to do to fill in those evidentiary gaps so that we know that people are getting evidence-based healthcare? And sometimes you can convince the drug company to do that. You can say, look, why don't you do a small trial in non-ambulatory boys? Or why don't you do a small trial in whatever? But sometimes you have to think out of the box. Say the drug company is not interested in doing that or says we don't have the money or it's too risky or what have you. Well, that's when you end up finding a friendly physician who is willing to take on the burden of doing what they call an investigator-initiated trial. They get the drug free from the company through expanded access or what is known as compassionate use, and they're the ones who collect the data. And that data, even though it's not from the drug company and even though it's not from a clinical trial, it can still be submitted to the FDA and payers. This expanded access data is increasingly being viewed as robust as long as the data collection was thorough and rigorous and what have you. And those are things where patient advocacy groups can step up and say, look, we're going to help fund this. We know this is a cost. Someone in your clinic is going to have to do the record keeping, et cetera, but it's relatively cheap in the scheme of things. And it does end up providing this data that can either say, yes, we support using this drug in these people who were excluded from the trial. This is not data that the drug company collected, but it's something we thought was important for our patient base, or, wow, who would have thought it, but there seems to be toxicity in this particular group of patients. We didn't know, they weren't in the trial, but now that we know, we really want to be cautious about using this drug in these patients. So those are the sort of creative solutions that I'm always encouraging people to think about. There's normally a way to do something if there's a will, but I really do think you have to look at it from what is a well-meaning doctor likely to prescribe, and is there evidence for it or not? And if so, how do we get that evidence and high-quality evidence?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And one of the things just is this real world evidence, and in our community specifically, where manufacturers already have a drug on market and it's approved or indicated for, let's say, my disease, spondyloarthritis. But then you'll talk to another 10, 20, 100 patients with the same diagnosis, and that drug does absolutely nothing. Because there's something about us that's individual, right? And I know for our organization, we've just developed, thanks, shout out to Forward National Data Bank for Rheumatic Diseases, has built the AiArthritis database within their servers under their IRB, and with the hope to start to really investigate those subgroups and responses, and at least identify hey, there's something here. These patients are not responding, these are, and collecting some biosamples, biomarkers, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if I was Empress of the world, which I'm obviously not, it's probably a really good thing I'm not. Any off-label use of an approved product would either be, at very least, with a registry where you're collecting that data, or preferably actually have it be an observational study so that you can get the most robust and reliable data as possible. Because there's a lot of, it seems plausible, let's try it. It probably won't hurt. It might help. And I don't have anything else to offer this person. And that is just not an evidence-based way of doing medicine. And, I need look no further than whatever we're dealing with now, COVID-19, to see the number of hypotheses out there that were totally plausible and then did not actually work or else caused harm to patients. So to me, this idea that even well-meaning people treating someone with something without an evidentiary base, it's just not something that should happen. And to the extent it does happen, it should be within these data gathering systems so that as soon as possible we can see safety signals or really start to understand, it does seem to work for people who have this cluster of characteristics. It doesn't seem to work for these people. It's a mixed picture for these other people, which means we need to dive down even further in this. I do a lot of work in ALS, and I'm completely convinced at some point people are going to decide ALS is not one disease. It's probably like 60 diseases,
Really? Okay.
just like cancer, because you have someone like Stephen Hawking who lives a long, productive life. And yes, he's in a wheelchair and he has, disabilities, but, emotionally and cognitively and what have you, he, as far as I know, I'm not a doctor, seem just fine. However, you also see ALS patients where there's agitation, there's personality changes, there's a rapid decline. Frequently people die within 3 years of onset. That is not the same disease. That is a very different phenotypic picture. And so I really think, just like you're talking about with your cluster of well, they gave us all the same name, but we don't seem to be responding to drugs the same way or having the same lived experience. I think it's the same in something like ALS. And it really, for ALS, I mean, there just needs to be a massive amount of epidemiological work, biospecimens being taken and studied, and really just an understanding of the basic science of what's happening in this disease. We have no treatments for ALS at this point, or we have one or two, but they're not very effective. And, it does not surprise me at all. You can throw as many things as you want at something, but the likelihood it's going to work when you don't even understand the biology of the condition just seems fleetingly low. So,
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us back to the whole conversation about why we're early in precision medicine, and there's such a need to do research that is credible, research that is ethical, and it's exciting though. And that's one of the things I want the listeners to really know, that it's everywhere. I was just at EULAR, and 80% of everything that was presented was about biomarkers and subgroups. And so it's there, but we have a journey.
Well, it's super exciting. And I mean, you just feel like right over the horizon, there's like, just such a different era waiting. But I am an ethicist, so I have to be a stick in the mud and just, always bring it back to questions of equity and access and what have you. And, only the people who are in these studies, only the people whose conditions are being included in our trials or in those epidemiological studies are going to be the ones to really benefit. So we have to be incredibly clear-eyed about who can't get to trial sites, who can't participate in the trial because of inclusion or exclusion criteria,
Yep.
who, if the trials are all requiring visits from 9 to 5 during the day, who cannot take off from work or has other obligations that's going to prevent them from participating. Even things like registries and wearables that people are talking about, stuff like this. We have a digital divide. There are many people in this country who don't have access to Wi-Fi. So for all the excitement that there is out there, we need to be consistently asking ourselves, who is not being included in this, with the knowledge that if we don't proactively find some way to include them, they will be left even further behind.
Yeah, that's an extremely valid and important point, especially just thinking of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, all of those things, which we know has really shined a light through COVID, and something that we at our organization, well, with the show, actually the 360 part of it is it spins off into many different directions, any type of communication. So here I am sitting with you at a conference. It could be going out in public, in the communities, to talk to people, to educate, to get their input. And then we're talking about research. That's just a big barrier. How do we get the right representation? And I know we're not there yet, but definitely everybody's working towards that goal. There's no doubt. So is there anything else that you wanted to add or share from either the session today or, I don't know, life in general?
I think it's really great that you're here. This is a primarily industry conference, and it's so important to have non-industry voices here. I know frequently, far too frequently in my work with industry, I will say to, random researcher at random company, have you ever met a patient with whatever it is that you are, and they'll say no. And I just think having the opportunity to interact with people, to put a face on a condition and to hear from them directly about what's most important to them. For Duchenne, I said repeatedly that ambulation is a easy thing for researchers to measure. Well, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, which is a fantastic patient advocacy organization, has done patient preference work within its community and said what's most important to you. And walking is not at the top of the list. It's being able to do things like self-toilet without your parents having to help you, or be able to use your fingers enough to use your phone because you are now an adolescent boy and you want to be able to game or text or what have you. So really hearing from the patients themselves what it is that is a meaningful endpoint, and then having that meaningfully funneled back into the drug development process, so we end up with drugs that address patient and caregiver needs, not something that was just easy to measure. That's why I think it's so important that you're here. So thank you for having made this arduous journey with a broken toe to come here and be a part of this.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a broken toe. I broke it a few hours, literally like the night before I was leaving, and it has not been a very walking friendly environment here, to say the least. It's very spread out, but I did have the opportunity to meet Alison, and I'm very excited about that. Alison, it's been great to speak with you, and would love to follow up and just keep you abreast on work, maybe pick your brain again on some things related to all of this.
That sounds fantastic. I hope that you heal soon. It was a pleasure to meet you, Tiffany, and I look forward to hearing more about your organization and all the work it's doing with outreach and whatnot. Sounds fantastic.
All right. Thank you so much.